The morning mist clung to the manicured lawns of Anmer Hall like a protective veil, shielding the Georgian manor from the outside world. Princess Catherine stood at the kitchen window, cradling a steaming cup of tea, watching as her 3 children chased their spaniel across the dew-laden grass. The sight filled her with the same contentment she had felt every morning for the past decade since she and William had made this Norfolk estate their true home. Anmer Hall was more than a residence, it was Catherine's refuge from the relentless scrutiny of royal life. Here, in this 10-bedroom country house gifted by Queen Elizabeth II, she could be simply Kate, a mother hanging washing on the line, teaching Prince George to drive a tractor, or helping Princess Charlotte collect eggs from the chickens that roamed freely in the expansive grounds. The sound of gravel crunching under tires drew her attention away from the pastoral scene. A black Range Rover approached the circular driveway, and Catherine recognized the purposeful stride of James Morrison, the estate manager, as he emerged from the vehicle. His usually calm demeanor seemed troubled, and Catherine felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, the same sensation she experienced whenever palace business threatened to intrude on their family sanctuary. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," James said as Catherine opened the back door to greet him. His formal address, reserved for serious matters, confirmed her suspicions that this was not a routine visit about estate maintenance or local village affairs. "James, please, we've discussed this." "It's Catherine when we're here," she replied, gesturing for him to enter the warm kitchen where the aroma of freshly baked scones filled the air. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's troubling you?" James removed his cap and ran his weathered hands through his graying hair. At 62, he had managed rural estates for over 4 decades, and Catherine had never seen him this visibly unsettled. "Ma'am, I've received some concerning information about the Blackwood property adjacent to our eastern boundary. The family has accepted an offer from a development consortium called Thames Valley Enterprises." Catherine set down her teacup with deliberate care, her mind immediately racing through the implications. The Blackwood estate encompassed nearly 200 acres of pristine countryside that had remained unchanged for generations. Ancient hedgerows lined its borders, providing corridors for wildlife and maintaining the unspoiled character that made this corner of Norfolk so special. "Development?" Catherine's voice remained steady, though her heart rate quickened. "What kind of development?" "A luxury housing development," James replied, producing a folder from his briefcase. 47 executive homes, complete with a golf course, spa facilities, and what they're calling boutique retail opportunities. The planning application was submitted to the local council last week. Catherine accepted the folder with trembling hands. The architectural renderings showed sprawling modern homes that seemed to mock the traditional Norfolk vernacular. Manicured fairways stretched across fields where she had often seen deer grazing in the early morning light. The proposed entrance would be less than half a mile from Anmer Hall's main gates. "The noise, the traffic, the loss of privacy," Catherine murmured, more to herself than to James. "This would completely transform the character of the area." "I'm afraid there's more," James continued reluctantly. "I've learned through my contacts at the planning office that this is just phase 1. Thames Valley Enterprises has been quietly acquiring options on several other properties in the district. If this development succeeds, it could open the floodgates for massive expansion throughout the region." Catherine sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her mind reeling. For years, Anmer Hall had provided her family with something precious and, increasingly rare, genuine privacy and connection to the natural world. Prince George had learned to identify bird calls in these woods. Princess Charlotte had taken her first steps in the walled garden. Prince Louis had caught his first fish in the stream that meandered through the property. More than personal sanctuary, this landscape represented something fundamental about Britain itself, the rolling countryside that had inspired poets and painters, the agricultural heritage that sustained communities for centuries, the delicate balance between human habitation and natural preservation. "What are our options?" Catherine asked, her pragmatic nature asserting itself over her initial shock. James opened another section of his folder. "The planning process provides several opportunities for public input. There will be community meetings, environmental impact assessments, and a formal objection period. However, Thames Valley Enterprises is well-funded and experienced in navigating these processes. They've successfully completed similar projects across the home counties.
But surely the council must consider the impact on the local community, on traffic patterns, on the environment? In theory, yes. But the reality is more complex.
The consortium is promising significant economic benefits, construction jobs, ongoing employment at the resort facilities, increased council tax revenues.
In the current economic climate, these arguments carry considerable weight with local officials.
Catherine stood and walked back to the window, where she could see Prince William's helicopter approaching for landing in the designated area near the stables. His return from his morning engagements in London had perfect timing. She would need his counsel for the challenges ahead.
James, I want you to gather everything you can about Thames Valley Enterprises. Who are the principals? What other projects have they completed? Are there any legal or regulatory issues in their history?
And please arrange a meeting with the parish council. I want to understand exactly how this planning process works.
Of course, ma'am. Should I also reach out to our legal team?
Yes, but discreetly. I don't want to signal alarm before we understand the full situation. Catherine paused, watching William's helicopter touch down with practiced precision.
And, James? I want you to know that we're not simply going to accept this as inevitable.
This community has been our home, and the home of countless families for generations. If there's a way to preserve what makes this place special, we're going to find it. As James departed with his instructions, Catherine remained at the window, contemplating the challenge ahead. She had faced public scrutiny, media invasions, and the constant pressure of royal protocol, but this felt different. This was a direct threat to the sanctuary that had allowed her family to maintain some semblance of normal life. The sound of children's laughter drew her attention back to the garden, where Prince George was attempting to teach his younger siblings how to build a proper cricket wicket. The scene filled her with renewed determination.
These moments, unguarded, joyful, authentically familial, were precisely what the proposed development would destroy. William appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his flight suit, his expression questioning as he observed her contemplative mood. "Everything all right?"
James looked rather serious when I saw him leaving. Catherine turned from the window and moved into her husband's embrace, drawing strength from his steady presence. "We have a situation that requires some strategic thinking," she said, her voice carrying the quiet resolve that William had learned to recognize as a prelude to determined action.
"Tell me."
As Catherine explained the morning's revelations, she watched William's expression shift from casual interest to focused concern. His military background had trained him to assess threats quickly and thoroughly, and she could see him mentally cataloging the various implications of the proposed development. "The security aspects alone are concerning," he said after she finished. "But, beyond that, this place has been our children's foundation of normal life. The freedom to explore, to connect with nature, to understand their heritage through this landscape, it's irreplaceable."
"Exactly."
But James made it clear that stopping this won't be simple. The developers have resources and experience.
The local council will be influenced by promised economic benefits.
William moved to the window, studying the peaceful scene that might soon be transformed by construction noise and tourist traffic.
"Then, we need to be smarter and more strategic than they are. This isn't just about our family's privacy, it's about preserving something essential about rural Britain." I was thinking the same thing.
If we approach this as a broader conservation issue, we might find allies among local residents, environmental groups, and heritage organizations. And we have advantages they might not expect, William added thoughtfully. Your background in art history gives you understanding of cultural preservation. My work with environmental causes provides connections to conservation groups. Most importantly, people trust us to act in the community's best interest rather than purely for personal gain. Catherine felt a familiar surge of appreciation for her husband's ability to see beyond immediate challenges to strategic opportunities.
"So we're agreed? We're going to fight this?"
"Absolutely. But we're going to fight it the right way, through community engagement, proper channels, and with respect for everyone's legitimate interests." As they stood together planning their response, Catherine felt the same determination that had sustained her through the most challenging periods of royal life. The stakes were different this time, not protocol or public opinion, but the preservation of a way of life that had nurtured their family and countless others for generations. The battle for Anmer Hall's peaceful surroundings was about to begin, and Princess Catherine was prepared to use every resource at her disposal to preserve the sanctuary that had given her family something money couldn't buy: the gift of an ordinary, extraordinary life in the English countryside. Outside, the children's voices echoed across the grounds, a sound that had become as essential to Catherine's definition of home as the morning mist and ancient oak trees. Whatever the cost, whatever the complexity, she was determined that future generations of children would experience the same magical connection to this timeless landscape. The preservation of Anmer Hall's tranquil environment had become more than a personal mission; it was a fight for the soul of rural England itself. 3 days after James Morrison's disturbing revelation, Catherine found herself in the unlikely setting of the village hall in nearby Sandringham, surrounded by folding chairs and the aroma of industrial-strength tea. The monthly parish council meeting had never seemed so crucial to the future of her family's sanctuary. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, smart but approachable clothing that respected the formality of civic engagement while avoiding any suggestion of superiority. Her presence at local government meetings was not unprecedented, but tonight carried special significance that rippled through the assembled crowd of farmers, shop owners, and longtime residents. Margaret Hutchinson, the 73-year-old council chairwoman, called the meeting to order with the authority of someone who had shepherded local affairs through decades of change. Her weathered hands and no-nonsense demeanor reflected a lifetime of practical problem-solving in rural Norfolk. Before we address tonight's primary agenda item, Margaret announced, "I want to acknowledge that we have some special guests this evening who have expressed interest in the Blackwood development proposal." Catherine felt the subtle shift in the room's energy as eyes turned toward her and William, who sat among the other residents rather than in any position of prominence. This careful positioning had been deliberate; they wanted to participate as concerned community members rather than as visiting royalty dispensing opinions from on high. "Mrs. Hutchinson," Catherine said, rising from her chair, "thank you for allowing us to participate tonight. My husband and I are here simply as residents who care deeply about preserving the character of this community we're privileged to call home." The murmur of approval from the assembled crowd encouraged Catherine to continue. "Like many of you, we've recently learned about the proposed development on the Blackwood property. While we absolutely respect the rights of property owners to make decisions about their land, we believe this particular proposal raises concerns that extend far beyond any single family's interests." David Cartwright, a dairy farmer whose land bordered both Anmer Hall and the Blackwood property, stood to address the group. His ruddy complexion and calloused hands testify to decades of working the land that would be directly affected by increased traffic and disruption. "Your Royal Highness," he began, his voice carrying the directness that characterized rural Norfolk communication, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm curious about your specific objections to development that could bring jobs and investment to our area." Catherine had anticipated this question and appreciated Cartwright's willingness to voice what others might be thinking. "Mr. Cartwright, that's exactly the kind of honest discussion this situation requires. Our concerns fall into several categories: environmental impact, traffic safety, preservation of agricultural heritage, and the precedent this development would set for future proposals throughout the region." William rose to support his wife's response. "David, we've reviewed the traffic impact studies, and the proposed development would increase vehicle movements through our narrow country roads by approximately 300% during peak periods. That affects everyone: the school buses, farm equipment, emergency services access." Emma Patterson, who operated a small tea shop in the village center, leaned forward in her chair. "But Thames Valley Enterprises is promising that the resort facilities will bring tourists who might patronize local businesses. Couldn't that help our economy?" "That's certainly possible," Catherine acknowledged. "But we should examine the actual track record of similar developments. William and I have been researching Thames Valley's previous projects, and the results are mixed at best." She produced a folder containing printouts and photographs. Their development in Oxfordshire promised similar benefits 5 years ago. Local businesses initially saw increased customers, but within 18 months, the resort had built its own shopping complex, restaurant, and conference facilities. The nearby village shops actually lost business because tourists never needed to leave the resort grounds. Margaret Hutchinson studied the materials Catherine had brought. "These are concerning patterns.
What about employment opportunities? Surely local people would benefit from jobs at the resort?
The employment picture is complicated, William explained. Resort and spa operations typically require specialized training and experience that may not match local skill sets. Thames Valley tends to recruit managers and technical staff from outside the community.
Local hires are often in lower-wage service positions with irregular hours.
Robert Fleming, whose family had farmed the area for 4 generations, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I hate to say this, but farming isn't what it used to be economically. If this development could provide alternative employment for young people, maybe that's worth considering.
Catherine could hear the pain in Fleming's voice, the recognition that traditional rural livelihoods were under constant pressure from global economic forces beyond any individual's control.
This was precisely the vulnerability that developers exploited when promoting their projects. Mr. Fleming, your point highlights exactly why this decision is so important, she responded carefully.
If we're going to consider changes to our community, shouldn't we explore options that build on our existing strengths rather than replacing them entirely? What do you mean? Fleming asked. Norfolk has incredible agricultural heritage, stunning natural beauty, and authentic rural character that tourists are increasingly seeking.
Rather than surrendering to generic resort development, we could explore sustainable tourism that celebrates and supports local farming, traditional crafts, and heritage preservation. Margaret Hutchinson's eyes brightened with interest.
Are you suggesting alternative development strategies? Exactly.
William and I have been researching successful rural tourism initiatives throughout Britain and Europe. Communities that focus on authentic experiences, farm stays, heritage trails, local food production, traditional craft workshops often generate more sustainable economic benefits than resort developments.
Catherine could see she had captured the room's attention.
These were practical people who understood the value of building on existing assets rather than abandoning them for uncertain promises.
But such initiatives require coordination and investment, Emma Patterson observed. How would local businesses access the resources needed to develop these alternatives? William leaned forward, his enthusiasm evident.
That's where organizations like the Prince's Countryside Fund and various heritage trusts can provide support. There are grant programs, technical assistance, and marketing resources available for communities that want to preserve their character while building economic sustainability. David Cartwright rubbed his chin thoughtfully.
This sounds promising, but what about the immediate situation? Thames Valley has already submitted their planning application. Are we too late to affect the outcome?
Not at all, Catherine replied.
The planning process provides multiple opportunities for community input.
But we need to be strategic and well organized in our response. Margaret Hutchinson consulted her notes.
The first public hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. What would you recommend as our next steps?
Catherine had been hoping for exactly this question. I propose we form a steering committee to coordinate community response. We need to commission independent studies of traffic impact, environmental effects, and economic implications. We should also develop a detailed alternative vision for sustainable development that serves local interests.
That sounds expensive, Robert Fleming observed.
William and I are prepared to fund the necessary studies and expert consultations, Catherine said. But the vision and strategy must come from the community itself.
This can't be perceived as outside interference, it must be an authentic expression of local priorities. The room fell silent as residents digested the magnitude of what Catherine was proposing.
She could see the mental calculations taking place, weighing the effort required against the potential benefits, considering the risks of opposing well-funded developers, evaluating the credibility of the alternatives being suggested.
Emma Patterson broke the silence.
Your Royal Highness, I appreciate your offer to fund professional studies, but how do we know that your alternative vision would actually work?
What guarantees do local businesses have that sustainable tourism would provide reliable income?
There are no guarantees, Catherine replied honestly.
But there are also no guarantees that the Thames Valley development would deliver its promised benefits.
What we're proposing is a careful, evidence-based evaluation of all options before making decisions that will affect this community for generations.
David Cartwright stood again. "I move that we establish the steering committee Her Royal Highness has proposed, with representatives from farming, business, and residential interests. We need professional analysis before making any judgments about this development." "I second the motion," Emma Patterson added.
"But, I want to be clear that accepting help with studies doesn't commit us to any particular outcome.
We need to keep all options open while we gather facts."
Margaret Hutchinson called for a vote, which passed unanimously. As the meeting concluded and residents began filing out into the cool Norfolk evening, Catherine felt cautiously optimistic about the community's willingness to engage seriously with the challenges ahead. Walking back to their car, William took her hand.
"That went better than I expected."
"You struck exactly the right tone, respectful but determined, offering resources without dictating outcomes." "The real work starts now," Catherine replied.
"We need to deliver on every promise we made tonight.
If the studies don't support our concerns, or if the alternative vision isn't genuinely compelling, we'll lose credibility permanently. But, if we're right, if sustainable development really can provide better outcomes for the community, we'll have created a model that could inspire similar efforts throughout rural Britain." Catherine looked back at the village hall, where lights were finally being turned off after decades of similar meetings addressing local concerns.
"That's exactly what I'm hoping. This fight isn't just about preserving our family's peace and privacy.
It's about proving that rural communities can control their own destiny when they have access to proper resources and expertise." As they drove through the darkened countryside toward Anmer Hall, Catherine reflected on the evening's progress. The battle against Thames Valley enterprises would require sustained effort, strategic thinking, and careful collaboration with people whose livelihoods depended on the decisions being made. But, tonight had demonstrated something invaluable: the community's willingness to consider alternatives to passive acceptance of outside development pressures. The preservation of Norfolk's rural character had found its first organized expression, and Princess Catherine had successfully positioned herself not as a privileged objector, but as a committed partner in the community's efforts to shape its own future. The converted barn on Margaret Hutchinson's farm had become an unlikely war room in the fight against Thames Valley enterprises. Tables covered with maps, environmental studies, and legal documents created a command center that would have impressed military strategists, while the aroma of freshly baked Victoria sponge provided a distinctly British comfort to the proceedings. Catherine arrived for the steering committee's emergency meeting carrying a folder that had taken 3 weeks of intensive research to compile. The expression on her face suggested that the intelligence gathered would significantly escalate their campaign against the proposed development. "I'm afraid we have a problem," she announced without preamble, setting her materials on the central table where David Cartwright, Emma Patterson, Robert Fleming, and Margaret Hutchinson had gathered for what they had assumed would be a routine progress update. "Thames Valley Enterprises isn't just developing the Blackwood property," Catherine continued, spreading out a detailed map of the surrounding region. "They've been systematically acquiring options on properties throughout this entire area under various subsidiary companies and shell corporations." The assembled group leaned forward to examine the map, where Catherine had marked properties using different colored pins. The pattern that emerged was both comprehensive and alarming. Thames Valley had secured development rights or purchase options on nearly 1,500 acres surrounding Anmer Hall.
Emma Patterson traced the marked boundaries with her finger.
"This would encompass my tea shop, the entire village center, and most of the working farms in the district." "Exactly," William confirmed, entering the barn with additional documentation. "Our legal team has uncovered what appears to be a coordinated strategy to acquire the entire region for large-scale resort and residential development. The Blackwood project was never intended to be standalone, it's the first phase of something much larger." David Cartwright sank into his chair, his weathered face reflecting the magnitude of what they were confronting.
"How is this possible? Surely property owners would have mentioned if they were considering selling. Many of them probably don't realize the full implications," Catherine explained.
"Thames Valley's representatives approach property owners with attractive preliminary offers, but the contracts include clauses that automatically extend the options if certain development milestones are achieved. Success with the Blackwood project would trigger options on dozens of other properties." Robert Fleming studied the map more closely, his expression growing increasingly troubled.
"My farm is marked here. But I never agreed to sell to any development company.
Check with your solicitor about any documents you've signed in the past 2 years, William suggested. Thames Valley often disguises option agreements as agricultural consultation contracts or mineral rights surveys. Margaret Hutchinson removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. At 73, she had witnessed many changes in rural Norfolk, but nothing approaching the scale of transformation they were now confronting. If this development proceeds as planned, it would effectively end traditional rural life in our entire district.
That's precisely what we're dealing with, Catherine confirmed. But there's more. Our environmental consultants have identified serious problems with Thames Valley's impact assessments.
She opened another section of her folder, revealing photographs of wetlands, wildlife corridors, and protected habitats. The Blackwood property includes critical breeding habitat for endangered species that aren't mentioned in Thames Valley's environmental review. Additionally, their drainage and construction plans would significantly impact the watershed that supplies drinking water to 3 neighboring villages.
Emma Patterson examined the wildlife photographs with growing alarm.
These are the meadows where we see barn owls and red kites regularly. The children from our village school come here for nature walks every spring.
The environmental violations alone could provide grounds for stopping the development, William noted. But we need independent verification from recognized scientific authorities.
I've arranged for teams from the University of East Anglia and the Norfolk Wildlife Trust to conduct comprehensive ecological surveys, Catherine announced. They'll document current wildlife populations, identify protected species, and assess the potential environmental damage from development.
David Cartwright looked up from the legal documents he had been reviewing.
This is all very encouraging, but I'm concerned about the costs of fighting a company with Thames Valley's resources.
How long can we sustain this kind of opposition?
Catherine had been expecting this question and had prepared carefully for her response.
David, the financial resources aren't the primary concern.
What we need is sustained community engagement and strategic coordination. The most expensive legal battles aren't won by outspending opponents, they're won by building cases so compelling that opponents choose to withdraw rather than face public defeat.
What do you mean? Robert Fleming asked. William spread out newspaper clippings from across the UK.
Thames Valley has a pattern of abandoning projects when communities organize effective opposition. They depend on surprising local residents with rapid development approvals before opposition can organize. When faced with sustained, professional resistance, they typically seek easier targets. But that assumes we can maintain community support through what could be years of legal proceedings, Margaret Hutchinson observed. Which is why we need to expand our strategy beyond simply opposing Thames Valley's plans, Catherine replied. We need to demonstrate concrete alternatives that provide genuine economic benefits to local residents. She moved to a large display board that had been covered with a sheet. Removing the covering revealed a detailed artist's rendering of the district as it could exist under a sustainable development plan.
This is our alternative vision, Catherine announced.
Instead of surrendering rural character to generic resort development, we propose creating a heritage tourism destination that celebrates and supports traditional Norfolk agriculture, crafts, and natural beauty. The rendering showed working farms connected by walking and cycling trails, historic buildings converted to artisan workshops and farm-to-table restaurants, and carefully designed accommodation that complemented rather than competed with the existing landscape.
Emma Patterson studied the drawings with obvious interest.
This would actually preserve the character that makes our area special while providing economic opportunities.
Exactly. And, unlike Thames Valley's promises, this vision builds on existing community strengths rather than replacing them, William explained. Local farmers could diversify income through agritourism. Traditional craftspeople could access markets for their products. Small businesses could benefit from visitors seeking authentic rural experiences.
David Cartwright remained skeptical but intrigued.
This looks wonderful, but how do we know tourists would actually be interested? And what about the initial investment required to make it reality? Catherine had anticipated these practical concerns.
We've commissioned market research from tourism professionals who work throughout rural Britain. The demand for authentic heritage experiences is growing rapidly, especially among visitors seeking alternatives to generic resort destinations. As for investment, William added, we've identified multiple funding sources: heritage lottery grants, rural development funds, sustainable tourism initiatives, and private investment from organizations committed to environmental and cultural preservation. Margaret Hutchinson leaned back in her chair, contemplating the magnitude of what was being proposed. You're suggesting that we not only fight the Thames Valley development, but simultaneously create an alternative that requires cooperation among dozens of property owners and businesses.
That's exactly what we're proposing, Catherine confirmed. And I understand it sounds overwhelming.
But consider the alternative: if we simply defeat Thames Valley's current proposal without offering alternatives, they'll return in 2 years with a modified plan, or other developers will attempt similar projects. Robert Fleming traced the heritage trail routes on the artist's rendering.
My grandfather used to say that the best defense is a good offense.
If we create something genuinely valuable, it becomes much harder for outside developers to justify destroying it.
Precisely, William agreed. And our research suggests that heritage tourism could generate more sustained economic benefits than resort development, because it doesn't depend on single large employers or seasonal visitor patterns.
Emma Patterson had been studying the financial projections Catherine had provided. These numbers suggest that sustainable tourism could actually provide more year-round employment than Thames Valley's resort proposal. With several important advantages, Catherine noted. The employment would be distributed among many local businesses rather than concentrated in a single resort company. The jobs would build on existing skills and interests rather than requiring extensive retraining. And the economic benefits would remain in the local community rather than flowing to outside corporate owners. The room fell silent as the steering committee members digested the complexity and potential of what they were considering. Catherine could see them mentally evaluating not just the immediate challenge of stopping Thames Valley's development, but the longer-term opportunity to reshape their community's economic foundation. David Cartwright was the first to speak. Your Royal Highness, this heritage tourism concept is attractive, but implementing it would require cooperation and coordination on a scale we've never attempted.
How do we know local people would actually participate?
We don't know until we ask them, Catherine replied honestly. That's why our next step must be comprehensive community consultation. We need to understand what local residents actually want for their future, what resources they're willing to contribute, and what concerns they have about both development options.
Margaret Hutchinson consulted her notebook.
I propose we organize a series of public meetings throughout the district. Every hamlet, every farm, every business needs opportunity to understand both the threats and opportunities we're discussing.
I agree, William said. But we also need to demonstrate that the heritage tourism concept isn't just theoretical.
We should identify 1 or 2 pilot projects that could begin immediately, showing concrete examples of how sustainable development actually works. Catherine smiled, recognizing the strategic thinking that had made William an effective leader in multiple contexts.
What did you have in mind?
Robert's farm has excellent potential for agritourism: beautiful location, traditional buildings, interesting agricultural operations.
Emma's tea shop could expand into local food production and craft sales.
If we could help develop these businesses over the next 6 months, they would provide tangible examples of heritage tourism benefits when we present our alternative plan. The energy in the converted barn shifted perceptibly as abstract concepts crystallized into specific, achievable actions. Catherine felt the familiar excitement that accompanied moments when complex challenges revealed practical solutions. The battle to preserve Norfolk's rural character was evolving beyond reactive opposition into proactive community development, and Princess Catherine was discovering that the skills acquired through years of royal duties, diplomacy, strategic planning, resource coordination, and sustained public engagement transferred remarkably well to grassroots organizing for community preservation. The village hall had never hosted an event quite like the one unfolding on this crisp October morning. Representatives from Thames Valley Enterprises faced a packed room of local residents, environmental scientists, heritage tourism experts, and media representatives who had gathered for what would become a defining moment in the battle for Norfolk's rural future. Catherine sat in the third row, deliberately avoiding any position that might suggest special privilege or influence. She had spent weeks preparing for this public hearing, but the morning's opening statements from Thames Valley's legal team had introduced complications that threatened to derail months of careful community organizing. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Richard Whitmore, Thames Valley's lead representative, "we appreciate the community's engagement with our development proposal. However, we want to address some misconceptions that appear to have gained currency through well-intentioned but misguided opposition efforts." Whitmore possessed the polished confidence of someone accustomed to managing public relations crises. His expensive suit and authoritative manner clearly intended to contrast with the rural simplicity of his audience, establishing expertise that local residents might find difficult to challenge. First, regarding environmental concerns that have been raised, Whitmore continued, consulting notes prepared by his legal team. Thames Valley Enterprises has conducted extensive environmental assessments using internationally recognized scientific methodologies. Our studies show minimal impact on local wildlife populations and full compliance with all relevant environmental regulations. Catherine felt her stomach tighten as Whitmore produced glossy reports that seemed to directly contradict the findings of the university researchers she had commissioned. She caught William's eye across the room and saw her concern reflected in his expression. Additionally, Whitmore announced, Thames Valley has secured commitments from major retail and hospitality brands that would establish Norfolk's first luxury destination resort. This would position our region as a competitor to the Cotswolds and Lake District for high-value tourism revenue. The murmur that rippled through the crowd suggested that many residents were hearing these details for the first time. Catherine realized that Thames Valley had been carefully managing information released to maximize impact at the public hearing. Most importantly, Whitmore concluded, Thames Valley Enterprises is prepared to offer direct financial benefits to local residents affected by construction activities. Every household within 2 miles of the development site would receive annual compensation payments for the duration of the construction period, plus priority hiring consideration for resort employment opportunities. Catherine watched as several farmers exchanged meaningful glances. The offer of immediate financial compensation could significantly influence residents facing ongoing agricultural economic pressures. Margaret Hutchinson, presiding over the hearing in her role as parish council chairwoman, invited community response to Thames Valley's presentation. Catherine had agreed to speak on behalf of the Heritage Tourism Coalition, but Whitmore's revelations required her to modify her prepared remarks significantly. "Thank you, Mrs. Hutchinson," Catherine began, rising from her seat. "Mr. Whitmore has presented information that requires careful examination before our community makes irreversible decisions about its future." She moved to the front of the room, carrying a folder containing materials that had arrived from the University of East Anglia just hours before the hearing began. Regarding environmental impact, independent scientific assessment by recognized academic authorities suggests substantially different conclusions than those presented by Thames Valley's consultants. Catherine distributed copies of the university's preliminary findings, which documented protected species populations and sensitive ecological zones that Thames Valley studies had failed to identify. The contrast between academic rigor and corporate environmental review was immediately apparent to anyone comparing the two reports. More concerning, Catherine continued, is that Thames Valley's financial compensation offers appear designed to address problems that their own environmental studies claim don't exist. Why offer compensation for construction disruption if the impact would be minimal? David Cartwright stood to address the assembly. Your Royal Highness raises important questions, but those of us trying to maintain family farms need to consider practical realities. Thames Valley is offering guaranteed income during uncertain economic times. Catherine recognized the tension in Cartwright's voice, the conflict between environmental concerns and immediate financial pressures that many rural families faced. This was precisely the vulnerability that sophisticated developers exploited when promoting projects of questionable long-term benefit. "Mr. Cartwright, you're absolutely right about the importance of economic security," Catherine replied. "That's exactly why we need to examine the full economic implications of both development options before making decisions." She moved to a flip chart that had been set up near the front of the room. Thames Valley promises construction employment and resort jobs, but their track record suggests different outcomes than their promotional materials indicate. Catherine revealed charts showing employment data from Thames Valley's previous developments. At their Oxfordshire resort, local employment peaked during construction but declined substantially once